Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of our post-COVID-19 class. This week, we're going to be talking about direct and indirect human impacts on ecosystems. Hopefully, you can all see my mouse. Otherwise, I'm actually going to switch to this spotlight arrow so you can see what I'm clicking on. There'll be a little blue arrow next to the thing I'm trying to highlight. All right, so we're talking about direct and indirect human impacts on ecosystems today. Thank you all for participating in the discussion portion of our class last week. We are going to have discussions again this week, and for the foreseeable future, that will be how you get graded. So before we dig into content, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we have coming up in the class. So first thing is we have a few due dates coming up. Just a reminder that if you are struggling with internet access or other issues related to your academics or to your home life or something, and you need help with anything, please reach out to me so I can help you figure out how to navigate this class and other classes possibly as well. I think that's the most important thing right now, is that we're all kind of trying to figure out how to manage our new normal. Second, we do have an invasive species project that I assigned last week. You'll see that on the invasive species page, but you can also see the assignments tab in Canvas. There's an assignment called Invasive Species Project where you can learn all about that project. It is pretty short. I pretty much just want you to do a quick research project on an invasive species, answer a few questions, put together some slides, and either record or write a script for yourself and then send me your slides. The due date for that is April 30th, which is our last day of scheduled class. But you can turn the assignment in anytime before that deadline. I really do suggest that you work on it earlier rather than later, because at the end of this semester, I'm imagining every single class you're in is going to have something due. So maybe just go ahead and try to knock it out in the next week or two, because it's pretty easy and then it'll be out of the way. And it is a big portion of your grade in this class. And you are welcome to contact me with questions at any of my emails or through a Canvas message. I'm happy to help you figure out how to manage that project. And then the last reminder here is that your plastics group project is still going to be required. We're still going to do it. It would be great if somebody in your group could send me your group hypothesis so I can make sure that the data that you need are available to you. So if every group could get together and have somebody send me their hypothesis in a message or an email, that would be really great. I just want to make sure you have the data that you need to get that project done. I think that I've got the data organized so that you can use it, but I just want to make sure. All right, let's talk about human impacts on ecosystems now. So there's two different types of human impacts, first of all, and I'm sure that this is pretty obvious from the title of the slideshow today. We have direct human impacts, which is when humans alter the ecosystem directly. So an example of this would be dredging. Like I go to a salt marsh and I dig out the salt marsh another like 10 or 20 feet deeper to make room for, say, a cruise ship port or some kind of shipping channel. That is a direct human impact. I'm altering the ecosystem directly. You can think of probably a dozen other examples of that. Keep that in mind for the discussion, because I'm sure I'm going to ask you about it. We also have indirect human impacts, which is when humans alter the ecosystem as an accidental byproduct of other activities. An example of this would be acid mine drainage. When we mine materials like coal in West Virginia, for example, there's usually an acid drainage that drains out of the mine and causes downstream issues. Another example of this in a coastal ecosystem would be nutrient pollution in coastal ecosystems, where we are, say we're farming, because that's what we do to make a living, and we put fertilizer on our farmland, and then all that fertilizer runs into a channel or a ditch or something, and that runs into a river, which runs into the ocean. Then we're going to have huge amounts of nutrients like nitrate and phosphate in our coastal ecosystem, which is going to lead to an algal bloom. The algae is going to consume all the oxygen, which is going to kill all the fish, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see how we didn't do that on purpose. It just is a thing that happened. So that's an indirect human impact. Hopefully you can differentiate between the two. Okay. I guess I gave you some examples. Good thing I remember what I'm doing. So here's some more examples of these two different things. You can see another example of indirect human impacts does include climate change and species invasion. Cool. So let's talk about habitat alteration. These are the result of indirect or direct human impacts, but here's some examples of habitat alteration. First, we have habitat degradation, which is usually an indirect human impact, where we leave the habitat intact, but we alter or damage it, making it unsuitable for organisms. And you can see a couple of examples here in the photos. Polar bears like to live on ice and sea ice in particular, and that's where they hunt. So if there's not a lot of sea ice, then the polar bears are going to have a really hard time having a place to live. Why are the polar ice caps melting? Climate change. We did that. It's an indirect impact. Another example is this coral. These are bleached corals. So we talked about how coral bleaching was a stress response from corals, and we're going to dig into that again, maybe later in the semester if there's time. Starting to think about that, and maybe there won't be time. But anyway, coral bleaching is a stress response usually due to warming. So again, that's an indirect human impact, and this reef is no longer suitable for these corals. Another example of habitat alteration is habitat fragmentation, and it can be indirect or direct. So this is a separation of a large habitat into smaller pieces. So an example of this that you can see here is these marsh channels, which we looked at in our salt marsh ecosystem lecture, and which we were, sadly, we were gonna go look at them this weekend at our field trip. That didn't happen. But habitat fragmentation basically makes it harder for organisms to move around in their habitat and can actually lead to fragmentation of species populations, which can lead to genetic bottlenecking and is all sorts of bad. So that is one issue. And another example of this would be building a highway through a forest. You might have seen on the internet that there are these underpasses and overpasses that people are making on highways now that are like just grass, that are allowing animals to travel across the highways so that they can get from one patch of woods to another patch of woods. Another example of this is just human development in general. The more we develop, the more we knock down trees. So the more we're destroying our ecosystems and fragmenting our ecosystems. And we can do that in the marine environment as well. It's a little bit more difficult. But if we put a shipping channel through the middle of a reef or through the middle of a salt marsh, that'll fragment our habitat as well. So we have to keep that in mind. And lastly, we get to the one that most people know, habitat destruction, which is mostly a direct human impact. And this is complete destruction of an ecosystem through human impact. And that is something that happens quite frequently, especially in the deep ocean. So I've got here a couple of photos from trawling expeditions. So one of the ways that we go fishing is that we have what's called a trawler. And what a trawler does is basically it takes a giant net and weighted apparatus, and it throws it behind the boat on a big long line, and it drags that apparatus along the ground or the benthic environment. And what that'll do is it will catch any fish that's hanging out down in there. And we know that fish like hanging out near the bottom around sponges or corals or whatever other like hard bottom reef there is. So we're trying to scoop up all those fish to eat them. But we also scoop up all the other things too. So you can see a couple of examples here where we have a coral ecosystem on the left, and then on the right in the trawled ecosystem, it is completely destroyed. We have a similar seamount deep water coral ecosystem in the second figure here on the left, and then on the right, again, it is completely flat. There's nothing there. And then we also have this sea fan ecosystem in the Northwest Atlantic down here in the bottom panel. On the left, you can see that it has, some organisms at least. And then on the bottom right, it's basically all gone. So bottom trawl fishing gear is a huge habitat destroyer. So you have to be careful with what kind of seafood you eat. And there's a way to figure that out, actually. There's this great app called the Seafood Watch app, and it is curated by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which maybe you've heard of. It's like the best aquarium in the world. And it will tell you what kind of fishing gear is used to catch each kind of fish and whether the fishing is sustainable or not. So that's a cool thing that I use to figure out what kind of fish I can actually eat without feeling really bad about destroying ecosystems. So that's habitat alteration. Next, we also have human coastal development and habitat destruction. So coastal development obviously is a huge destroyer of habitats. This is a great example. This whole area should not exist, but that's a different story for a different time. But as we develop our cities and as our populations in the coasts grow, we end up destroying habitat. So the way that that works is that our development, first of all, usually we have to raise the land above sea level so that it doesn't flood. And then we have to flatten it so that we can build on it. And then we build on it, which destroys whatever habitat was already there. Once we've done that, we're removing habitat, like it says here, removed for development purposes, including buildings and all sorts of other things. And then we have an indirect human impact of runoff, where we have dead zones from eutrophication, which is nutrient pollution, caused by agriculture runoff and sewage runoff. We're also going to remove vegetation to log and get the materials that we need to build. And removing vegetation is going to make the coastal ecosystem less stable, which means we're going to have more sediment runoff and soil erosion, which is again going to lead to more runoff and eutrophication over here. And because we have so many people, we're probably also going to have to dredge. And dredging is a way that we can basically make the water deeper so that we can ship things through the area. Dredging is a huge thing that we do all the time in every major city that has a port. Okay, some other impacts of habitat of human coastal development. Uncontrolled access, including off-road vehicles and boat washing, can result in erosion of dunes. So boat wash actually just means like the waves that the boats generate. So if you're speeding in a no wake zone, that's going to be a problem for your dune. And driving on the dunes is also going to make the dunes unstable. And we're not going to talk about how dunes work, but basically dunes are really important for protecting our shorelines, and they're a natural process. So our Outer Banks are an example of a dune environment. And you may have noticed that in most areas of North Carolina, the beach is public access, but the dunes are state property and you're not allowed to go on them. So you have to build over them. You're not allowed to build directly on them. We're trying to protect those dunes so that they don't erode too much and create a really unstable habitat for us. We already talked about bottom trawling being a problem. The sediment suspension issue in the bottom middle here is a removal of habitat that can result in increased sediment resuspension, which can make the habitat, again, less enjoyable for other organisms. And then we also have impoundments. So impoundments, that's an example of this would be like a dam upstream or a tidal barrage, which don't worry about that. But essentially what we can do is we can change the salinity of a habitat, and we can separate upstream from downstream, creating all sorts of problems for connectivity and reproduction of organisms. So that's what coastal development can do to an ecosystem. We also have an example of human impacts that I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with, and this figure looks horrible, is overfishing. And what this is supposed to be a figure of is an arrow moving from top left to bottom right, and we're going from big predatory fish to small fish that feed on primary producers. And this is called fishing down the food web. So the reason that this happens is because we overfish the big predators, right? So the goal of fishing is to maximize our yield, or the amount of fish that we catch, and minimize our effort. That means we're going to try to go close to shore and catch the biggest things we can find. Once the big things are gone there, we're going to move to wherever the big things are. And we're going to keep fishing the big things until we can't reasonably access any big giant fish. Once the biggest giant fish are gone, we're going to go down to the next biggest fish. But people are still hungry, so we're going to go down to the next biggest fish. And then people are still hungry, so we're going to go down to the next biggest fish. So we get to the point where we're not eating predators anymore. We're eating things that are just grazing on primary producers. So this is how we go from eating grouper and snapper in the Caribbean to eating parrotfish, which just is a thing that, like grass, eats algae. So overfishing is a big problem, and that is a direct human impact, and also kind of an indirect human impact, because we didn't mean to fish down the food web, but like people got to eat. So it's a complicated issue. How to solve the fisheries management problem is one. We could have an entire class on fisheries management and not get the answer. So if you're interested in that topic, I'm going to try to make a discussion topic available for you to dig into overfishing a little bit more this week. So one way that we're going to do that is name one way in which fishing down the food web impacts humans, and one way in which it impacts the ecosystem. You don't have to do that right away, but I am going to put that in the discussion for you this week. All right, additional threats from overfishing. I'm going to leave this for you to use in your discussion section, but I just wanted to make this available to you in case you needed to see some other examples of how overfishing can be problematic. Okay, now we're going to move on to runoff and eutrophication. So eutrophication just means an an increase in nutrients. And here's an example of runoff causing a problem. I already gave this example actually earlier in the lecture of acid mine drainage. So here we have an old mine, and we're not anywhere near the coast. We're like up in the mountains here in this example. But what happens is inland acid mine drainage, iron sulfide causes the color. So iron sulfide comes out of this mine, and it carries heavy metals downstream. So why might carrying heavy metals downstream be a problem? Hopefully you're saying, heavy metals can be toxic and downstream organisms, including humans, could consume them and die, and that's bad. That's exactly what's happening, or what could happen here. And if you Google acid mine drainage, you can learn all about it. It's been pretty problematic. It's something that we're starting to figure out how to remediate, but it is pretty problematic in places where we have old mines. Okay, so runoff and eutrophication in general, in addition to acid mine drainage, is a little bit less obvious. Eutrophication is just excessive nutrient input into a water body, and this is normally caused by runoff that has additional nutrients in it, and it causes algal blooms and fish kills. Let's see what I've got next. Yeah, so really what happens is we have nitrogen and phosphorus getting put into a water body in excess, and nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting reagents for growth, which means that without them, without additional input of them, growth can only happen to a certain extent. But if we add more nitrogen and phosphorus, more things are going to grow, right? And that doesn't necessarily sound bad, but you kind of have to think about it this way. If I add a whole bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus to a lake or a coastal ecosystem, who uses that for growth? It's not the fish or the big organisms that are important for us. It is instead the algae. The algae will use all this nitrogen and phosphorus, they'll grow, and they'll make a big surface algal bloom like this one, which is gross. And it's somewhat natural, but usually we add more nitrogen and phosphorus because we are doing other things upland, and that's causing a big problem. So this algal bloom, one, shades the sun and will kill everything that's underneath it that needs the sun for growth. And two, these algae consume oxygen at a really fast rate, and they use up all the oxygen in the water faster than the oxygen can be replenished, which means that other large organisms that need oxygen to breathe, like fish, are going to die. All this dead stuff is going to sink to the bottom and decay, where it's going to continue using more oxygen for decomposition, continuing to create what's called a dead zone. So this is how we get dead zones. I don't know if I have an example of that. I do. So here's a couple of examples of runoff and eutrophication causing issues. This is a UNC researcher in Lake Taihu in China, where they have a harmful algal bloom problem. You can see that the water in this lake is basically as thick as soup, and it does lead to massive fish kills and low oxygen in the water. There's basically nothing alive in this lake most of the year. Another example of this is another lake called Grand Lake St. Mary's in Ohio, and it is maybe the perfect case of a dead zone forming in a lake. There's also dead zones in Lake Erie and other places in the world now, but Grand Lake St. Mary's is not very big, and it's in a really rural area. So the way that it got extra nitrogen and phosphorus is that farmers were putting tons and tons and tons of fertilizer on their fields, because more fertilizer equals more growth, right? Well, it turns out that's not always true. Like, there's a certain point in which adding more fertilizer isn't going to cause any more growth, because things just can't grow any faster. But they were still putting more fertilizer out, and they were tilling their fields, which means they were turning it and creating more smaller particles, which could then easily run off. In addition to that, there used to be phosphates in detergent, like for washing your clothes. And then those phosphates would also run off into the water and create these huge algal blooms in addition. So the phosphates from the detergent from your washing machine and the nitrates from your farmland would create these huge environments where things could just grow like crazy. And this would do really big damage and kill all the fish. And Grand Lake St. Mary's is kind of close to where I'm from, and they are still having this problem every single summer where they have these big algal blooms. Okay, so additional runoff and eutrophication related issues that you've probably heard of, and I know we've talked about this a little bit in class, is the red tide. So the oceanic red tide is a type of harmful algal bloom, and the algae that are part of this red tide do produce toxins, somewhat neurotoxic. It can definitely kill small animals, including dogs, and it's not very fun for humans. It can definitely make you very sick. It's not the most fun thing to experience. It's really cool to look at because it's fun and red, but like it's really bad for you. So these oceanic red tides produce toxins, and high nutrients, low salinity, and then calm seas play a role in their formation. So high nutrient input is one of the reasons why we get these harmful algal blooms. Lastly, we talked about dead zones already, but here's a great example. You might know that the Mississippi River drains most of the continental United States. So that means that all of the upland farming and irrigation and any kind of pollution that happens that gets into a major river is going to flow downstream. And all of these pink areas are cities that are going to cause runoff, and all the green areas are places where we have farmland. So you can see that there's a huge amount of stuff just running into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River Delta. And as a result, we get what's called the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a huge area around the Gulf or around the Mississippi Delta where we have low oxygen because we have these algal blooms. And that's impacting fishing, which is a huge part of the lifestyle in Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta area. And it's also just a big part of our economy. So that's one of the things that runoff can do. The dead zone is probably the worst case scenario from runoff and eutrophication. All right, so how a dead zone is created in the Gulf of Mexico. We've kind of already beat this over the head, but I'm just gonna make sure everybody knows. Mississippi River water flows in, and it's got nitrogen-rich fertilizers and urban runoff and sewage in it. Populations of microorganisms are gonna eat that. Then they're gonna boom, which means they're gonna bloom. Those organisms will then die and sink to the bottom, where they're gonna consume oxygen in their decomposition. And then they're gonna bloom, and they're gonna die, and then they're gonna bloom, and then they're gonna die. And what that does is the bloom eats up all the oxygen, the decomposition eats up the rest of the oxygen, and then the fish and the invertebrates that can move out of the environment where there's no oxygen are gonna move. So we can't find them when we're trying to fish. Or if they can't move, they're gonna die, right? So that's a huge problem. And it's one that we're still trying to solve on a global scale. So how can we limit nutrient runoff? This is going to be one of our discussion topics for the week, is what can we do to limit nutrient runoff? What are some strategies we can use? I'm going to ask you for specific ideas. Please check the discussion to get involved in that. Okay, we're done with eutrophication. Now we need to talk about coastal erosion and sea level rise. So sea level rise is happening. My first question here is I designed this lecture for us to actually have in class, so I still have these little questions like, why is the sea level rising? And I know that you know this because we've talked about it and you've always answered correctly. Climate change, right? Ice caps are melting all around the world. More water in the ocean than there was before because big part of it was up in ice, and now that ice is melting. So as a result, the sea level is rising. That's problematic. For a lot of people who live near the coast. We can see that impacting our lowland areas and our coastal areas here in North Carolina. So now that we have talked a little bit about that, let's talk about some ways that we can deal with this issue. What we get when the sea level rises or when there's a storm is we get major coastal erosion, especially in places where we have a lot of sand. So this is a sandy beach. This is a highway on the side of a sandy beach. And this used to be a sandy beach, but now it's a big giant seawall. So what we do is we try to stabilize our environment. One way that we do that is we make it harder. We put concrete seawalls up or rock seawalls up to try to keep that shoreline hardened. And that's an okay strategy for people. The problem is that it messes with the ecosystem a ton. You can see how we don't really have a beach here anymore. Instead, we just have a seawall and like a little bit of gravel. Whereas here on the left, we have more of a beach situation. And what's going on here on the left is we have these groins. So there are these pieces of metal usually that run perpendicular to the shoreline out into the ocean. And what they do is they prevent the movement of sand. So this groin, for example, prevents the movement of sand behind it. So the current is going to run from bottom left to top right. It's called the longshore current. That's just the way that the current works at a beach. Every beach has a longshore current where the sand is going to be transported via the nearshore current in this direction that I'm making with my arrow from bottom left to top right. So if we put something in the way of that sand transport, then the sand is stuck behind it. That means that the sand can't move from down here because it's stuck behind this wall, right? So that keeps our sand from moving, which is great because then we still have a beach down here. The problem is that if we keep our sand from moving up, the sand is going to erode away and not get replaced in this next area. So then we need another groin, which is going to keep the sand in this area. And then we need another groin, which is going to keep the sand in this area. But you can see how there's an erosion arc in the middle here, where the sand is still eroding away, and it's pushing towards the sides because there's nowhere else for it to go. And sometimes this sand will just run offshore. And you can see a little bit of that here. There's a sand plume here and a sand plume here. So these groins are great because they stabilize the beach for tourists across a certain span, but they cause downdrift erosion, which means they cause the beach further downshore to just go away. So if there weren't groins, if there wasn't a groin here, this sand would erode in here until it was eroded all the way up here, and it would just eat this town alive. So they need all these groins to keep themselves stable now that they put a one groin in. Because of the problems related to groins, they're actually illegal in the state of North Carolina. And I got to admit to you that we are not a world leader in coastal ocean policy. We do not do a very good job managing our coastal resources and dealing with things like erosion and sea level rise. But we have made these groins illegal because they're that problematic. So you might think of what some other solutions are to stabilize our coastline beyond groins and seawalls. We are actually going to talk a little bit more about this in a couple of weeks when we talk about oyster restoration in North Carolina. But there's also this great YouTube video, which is no longer clickable, which is very frustrating. I'm sorry about that. About what we can do to deal with sea level rise. So I encourage you to go watch that video because I am going to talk about it in our discussion posts. So that's Human Impacts on Coastal Ecosystems 101. I'm going to try to make some videos available to you on our discussion page or on our page for this topic, so you can check that all out. Thanks for listening, and please reach out to me via email again if you have any questions or comments or concerns. Have a good week.